βλέπω τα πράγματα και την πιστεύω στον κόσμο αυτό. Ακολουθεί πάνω κάτω ένα ρεύμα που αντιπαλεύει τον αυταρχισμό. Υιοθετεί οριζόντιες δομές και παράγει τις ρίζες μιας νέας κοινωνίας. Θέτει φραγμούς στο κεφάλαιο το κράτος και κάθε αυθαίρετη σκέψη εξουσίας. Με την ιεραρχία θέλουμε ελεύθερη και άμεση δράση. Παίρνει ο καθένας μας πρωτοβουλία να αγωνιστεί τα δεσμά για να σπάσει. Οργανωμένα κι αυτόνομα σε γειτονιές, εργοστάσια και σε σχολεία. Χωρίς καθοδηγητές και αρχηγούς τραβάμε μπρος για μια νέα κοινωνία. Σκοπός τέλος του δρόμου η ελευθερία, η άνεση, η ανεμελιά και το πανιέρο δικαίωμα κάθε ανθρώπου του κόσμου στη δεμελιά. Η άγρια απόλαυση όλων των καρπών της τέχνης, τεχνολογίας και επιστήμης και μια ζωή σε επίπεδο κορφή σε πλανήτη αγάπης και αδελφοσύνης. Αυτά πιστεύω κι αν συμφωνείς μη σε πιάσει κρίση και παροξισμός. Γιατί αυτές είναι οι αρχές που πρέσβευε πάντα ο αναρχισμός. Μην παθήσω και στο πασό και άνοιξε το μυαλό το ρημάδι. Στρίξ τη ροφιά, κοίτα μπροστά, hey, και κράτα ψηλά ρε τα αλφάδι. Έχουμε πείσμα, δεν έχουμε φράγ. Μόνιμα θύματα, λάσπισες χρείς που την ξερνάνε από κάθε πλευρά. Βγες από το σπίτι, για στο Μικέλ. Βάλε φωτιά στο CD του Τερλέγκα. Η επανάσταση δεν θα είναι live. Μπες στη συνέλευση, κλείσε το Μέγα. Δεν είμαστε χουλιγκάνια και όρκ. Όντα του πόγκοσμου και τρομοκράτες. Κάποιοι από εμάς ακούνε και πιόρ. Και κάθε χώρος έχει και μαλάκες. Αν κατεβάζουμε μπλοκς κάνε μύτη, μηδένια και μπάχαλα και ασφαλίτες. Κλείς την TV σου και στήσε αυτή. Λένε τα συνθήματα ποιοι είναι οι αλήτες. Και θα μας δεις να φυτεύουμε σπόρους αυτοδιαχείρισης μέσα στο χώμα. Συλλογικότητες και συνελεύσεις, πρωτοβουλίες και με το παγώνα. Ρήγματα υπέροχα όλα ανθρωπιά. Στο απάνθρωπο τέρας κεφαλοκρατίας. Της επανάστασης μαύρα σχολιά που ανοίγουν δρόμο για κοσμοναρχία. Σ' αυτά πιστεύω κι αν συμφωνείς μη σε πιάσει κρίση και παροξισμός. Γιατί αυτές είναι οι αρχές που πρέσβευε πάντα ο αναρχισμός. Μην τρελαθείς, μη φοβηθείς, σβήσε τις λύθεις στο μαύρο σκοτάδι. Σφίξ τη ροφιά, κοίτα μπροστά, hey, και κράτα ψηλά ρε τα αλφάδι. Γιατί κι αν μας βρίζουν κανάλια και συντηρεί τούκλες και νοικοκυρέοι. Ένοντος πρίζουν οι τράπεζες, πολιτικοί, κράτη, μπάτσι και χρέη. Έγκλειστο ζει στο κλουβί που σου φτιάξαν παπάδες και αφεντικά. Πάρ' τη ζωή στα χέρια σου, σπάς αλυσίδες και βγάλε φτερά. Γιατί έχει έρθει στιγμή επιτέλους στο σάπιο το σύστημα ο ήλιος να δει. Και έναν αντίλη, μια κοινωνία βασισμένη σε ισότητα και αλληλεγγύη. Μ' αγώνα κι αντί στα σήμερα αυτή θα τη δεις όλο και πλησιάζει. Όσο θα σφίγγουν αυτή τα λουριά, έτσι και σένα το αίμα θα βράζει. Κι όσο εδίνουν την καταστολή, κι όσο για σένα θα αλλάζουν οι ρόλοι. Κι αυτά που είπαμε να τα σκεφτείς, τότε όταν θα σφίξουν οι κόλλοι. Μας χτυπάνε και πυροβολούν, τόσο οριζόνι βαθιά ιδέα. Στις γειτονιές μας και μες τις καρδιές μας υψώνουμε κόκκινη μαύρη σημαία. Αυτές είναι οι αρχές που πρέσβευε πάντα ο αναρχισμός. Φάνηκε εχθρός, ήρθε ο καιρός να εγκαταλείψεις το σάπιο κοπάδι. Σφίξ τη γροθιά, κοίτα μπροστά, hey, και κράτα τα αλφάδι ψηλά.
We had a couple of families living in the middle of Barry, Harrington Avenue. They were very strong anarchists, and they were very violent people, always trouble. Every Saturday night there'd be a party, and generally ended up in a fist fight, you know. And they were bad men with knives. They did a lot of their talking with their knives. But I was only 9, 10, 11 years old, so I don't remember too good. But of course, like we say, the good people didn't have nothing to do with them.
I am an antichrist. I am an anarchist. I know what
Why has this situation and condition come about in our country? It is because those in high public office have kowtowed to every anarchist group that have roamed the street.
Anarchy in the USA is coming sometime, maybe. I give a wrong time, stop a traffic line. Future dreams, shopping streets.
First, we must distinguish between the moderate and the radical, between the activist and the anarchist. This is critical. There's a difference between the two, and all of us must recognize it. The activist is seriously dedicated to social change. He knows this change will be difficult, but he believes it must come in a peaceful manner. The anarchist seeks only ruin and destruction, and he rides a tidal wave of terror.
Extremists are extremists, white, black, or whatever they are. And extremism is the midwife of anarchy.
Anarchism?
Anarchism, oh my goodness. Taking over by the government, by the people and the government. I really don't know. I know it's all a big mess.
What's anarchism?
Anarchism is when anyone does whatever they want without concern for anyone else.
What kind of image does that evoke for you?
Chaos.
What's anarchism? I would say that it's a person trying to push his views down everybody's throat.
What do you think? And what do you think?
Anarchy, yes, I think I'd agree with that. It's a dominant view of one person over everyone else.
Do you know anyone who's an anarchist now?
Yes, I do.
Who's that?
The Ayatollah Khomeini.
Another conference, which a friend of mine is organizing in Montpellier. Montpellier.
I was surprised I was able to even sit for one or two of those speeches.
He taught a class on God, and so he gave me the Hannah Hawk and Raoul Hausman and some of the John Hartfield and ultra man Ray fanatic.
Oh, I think it is very necessary to remain in my country and to act in my life.
Yeah.
Yes,
I've thought of it often.
What originally attracted me to anarchism, I wasn't attracted, I was conscripted. No, I was born into an anarchist family, and anarchism was like mother's milk to me, right? Everybody talked about it all the time when I was a child.
No, I don't think that Marx would ever have converted to other ideas I had. He was too authoritarian for that.
I think he was quite set in his ways.
Yes, unfortunately.
I think anarchism to most people does mean bomb throwing at first, but they don't know that it's an idea at all, and a whole political philosophy and a moral philosophy.
Are you here at the symposium? Are you an anarchist?
Am I an anarchist? I have studied all kinds of philosophical and political systems. I don't think I live up to any of them, but I do believe in personal freedom. And I believe that in order to change anything, you have to change yourself. So I don't know if that's anarchy.
Almost anyone, I suppose, could call himself or herself an anarchist if he or she believed that society could be managed without the state. And by the state, I don't mean the absence of any institutions, the absence of any form of social organization. The state really refers to a professional apparatus of people who are set aside to manage society, to preempt the control of society from the people. So that would include the military, judges, politicians, representatives who are paid for the express purpose of legislating, and an executive body that is also set aside from society. So anarchists generally believe that whether as groups or individuals, people should directly run society.
This is a clip from one of our first films, Inciting to Riot. We made it back in 1969 when we were in college and members of Transcendental Students, or TS.
Let me ask you a question now. I've heard a lot about TS, and I know that you're not into heavy doctrinaire bullshit like other radical groups. Can you elaborate on the politics of TS at all?
Yeah, well, like last year we had freakouts and stuff, and that was like taking over the South Study Hall, which was illegal in terms of the university, and just letting people do their own lifestyle thing in South Study Hall, and then the cops were called in to get us out of there. So it's challenging authority, but not like in a really heavy way. It's like creating free space so people can do their thing, and you know, if the cops come, and we leave, you know, guerrilla style, and go somewhere else. But you know, that kind of thing, we don't try to take people and push them anywhere. We try to create space where they can do their own thing.
Right, that's really groovy. Okay, now, if you can make one distinction between TS and STS, what would you say that is?
I guess we're anarchists.
Transcendental Students was our introduction to anarchism. At first, it simply meant rebelliousness, anti-authoritarianism, a way of directly confronting the war makers. But as we became increasingly active, our understanding of anarchism changed. And we discovered that anarchism had a colorful past and a legacy that was laced with drama and tension.
In Spain, during the Civil War of 1936, 3 million peasants and workers rallied under the banners of the anarchist organizations, the CNT and the FAI, to fight the fascist uprising in Barcelona. Spanish anarchists organized a whole system of production and distribution, substituting barter for money and shop committees instead of bosses or central committees.
Anarchist militias went to fight at the front, with soldiers free to come and go as they pleased. Collectives established libraries, free schools, and cultural centers, often in former churches or villas of the wealthy. For 3 years, anarchism existed in Spain. It was the culmination of nearly a century of agitation and organization that had created movements throughout Europe, Russia, and Latin America.
But there's also been a tradition of anarchism in the United States. In fact, there's an interesting theory that says the American temperament reflects many of the qualities that anarchism idealizes: distrust of government, suspicion of authority, and a belief in the plain old do-it-yourself ethic. So in the summer of 1980, we packed our gear into one of America's own cultural creations, an RV, and set out to explore anarchism in America.
God, we can't show you the shed because it's got that thing part.
No, it's our thing, at least temporarily.
But somebody might think it's ours, and the tax collector would be here and confiscate it immediately.
That reminds me. What's your relationship with the IRS these days?
Miserable, terrible.
Why is that?
Well, you know, they ask every now and then when I'm gonna behave myself. And I tell them never, and I don't know what they do.
Are you not paying federal taxes? Or?
Yeah, nothing.
Nothing. I guess they don't take too kindly to that.
No, they think it's terrible.
On the other hand, they're not being very active about it right now.
Well, no, the last time was here.
Like it's no fun anymore or something.
Something like that. The local people seem to take more of a kindly view, as though they really think it's a rotten thing, and I'm not doing anybody any harm, and that they seem to be more sensitive or decent somehow, but I don't know. The federal people...
what can they do?
Put me in jail. Well, I left school when I was 15 and went to work for a radio station and just stayed in journalism, and eventually after such places as Newsweek magazine, drifted into political writing, or writing for politicians. And I became a ghostwriter for, I suppose, all of this part of our century's major Republicans, including Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, and by '64 was Barry Goldwater's principal speechwriter. After the loss of that election, I ceased to be a Republican by request and became a commercial welder. Well, after I got evicted from the Republican Party, I began reading considerably more of the works of American anarchists, thanks largely to Murray Rothbard, who is a right-wing libertarian, I guess you could say.
Bre Petrun komori mai laimo, bre Petrun komai laimo, me se yo di memori obido, se yo di me obido me, nigdzie joro mori ne najdo, nigdzie joro ne najdo me, vaše selo mori dor trio, vaše selo dor triora, prvo joro mori Petrunki, prvo joro Petrunki, no Petrunčica mori jorovo, Petrunčica jorovo di, bre Petrunko mori mai lajmo, bre Petrunko mai lajmo me, bre Petrunko mori mai lajmo, bre Petrunko mai lajmo me, se jo di me mori obido, se jo di me obido me, nigdzie joro mori ne najdo, nigdzie joro ne najdo me, vaše selo mori dor trio, vaše selo dor triora, prvo joro mori Petrunki, prvo joro Petrunki, no Petrunčica mori jorovo, Petrunčica jorovo di, bre Petrunko mori mai lajmo, bre Petrunko mai lajmo.
The free market, or laissez-faire capitalist is what he is. But he's very familiar with the American anarchists, and I was just amazed. And when I read Emma Goldman, it was as though everything I had hoped that the Republican Party would stand for suddenly came out crystallized in this magnificently clear statement. And another interesting thing about reading Emma Goldman is that you immediately see that, consciously or not, she's the source of the best in Ayn Rand. She has the essential points that the Ayn Rand philosophy makes, but without any of this sort of crazy solipsism that Rand is so fond of, the notion that people accomplish everything all in isolation. Emma Goldman understands that there's a social element to even science, but she also writes that all of history is a struggle of the individual against the institutions, which of course is what I'd always thought Republicans were saying, and so it goes. In other words, in the old right, there were a lot of statements that seemed correct, and they appeal to you emotionally, and that's why I was a Republican. Isolationist, anti-authoritarian positions. But they're not illuminated by anything more than statement. They just are good statements. But in the writing of the anarchists, the same statements are made, but with this long illumination out of experience, analysis, comparison. It's rock solid. And so I immediately realized that I'd been stumbling around inventing parts of a tradition that was old and thoughtful and already existed. And that's very nice to discover that. I don't feel it's necessary to invent everything.
Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist leader, has returned to the United States after an exile of 15 years.
I'm delighted to be back in the United States, my hunting ground of 35 years, the country where I had my innings in the social and economic struggle, and where I decided to devote myself to the presentation of anarchism, a social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race.
Emma Goldman was perhaps the best known of the many immigrant anarchists who had come from countries all over Europe. Italians, Russians, Germans, and Spaniards had been converted to the ideas of anarchism, first preached by the Russians Michael Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin.
The immigrant anarchists envisioned a world without leaders, a system of mutual aid made up of interlocking federations and communes. The anarchists hoped their persistent educational efforts would pay off when the working classes would spontaneously rise up and overthrow their oppressors. These immigrants created a whole self-contained culture with their own schools, colonies, newspapers, and publications.
Together with other immigrant groups, they led anti-war protests during the First World War and were active in fighting the rising tide of fascism during the 1930s and 40s. And they were also the prime targets of government repression, earmarked for wholesale arrests, deportation, and lifelong harassment.
What do you think about Russia, Miss Goldman?
I consider Russia and America the most interesting countries in the world today.
How about Hitler?
I don't know him and don't want to.
What is your opinion of Italy?
Beautiful country minus Mussolini.
Miss Goldman, should the government here object to your speeches of anarchism, would you change them or leave the country?
I will leave the country rather than deny my ideas. I prefer to stick to my guns.
What is your opinion of Italy?
Beautiful country minus Mussolini.
Ms. Goldman, should the government here object to your speeches of anarchism, would you change them or leave the country?
I will leave the country rather than deny my ideas. I prefer to stick to my guns.
Emma answered very well. She was always very sharp.
Yeah, but that Emma is...
She said, I'll stick to my guns. That says it. Tells you everything.
Ironically, our exploration of anarchism in the United States took us to Cuernavaca, Mexico. Mexico had become the land of exile for many anarchists, among them a remarkable couple, Molly Steimer and her lifelong companion, Senya Fleshin. Like Emma Goldman, her friend and comrade, Molly had immigrated to the United States when she was in her early teens.
When I was in Russia and I lived through the pogroms on the Jews, or when I saw the soldiers going to the war, there was war, Russia, Japan. And I saw the soldiers, the peasants going to war and how the Cossacks treated them as if they were cattle. I thought it was because it is Russian Tsarism, brutality of the Tsar. I imagined that in America the people are better, that the people are finer, they have more sentiment, more understanding of liberty and would not mistreat one another. But then when I saw the persecution in the United States during the war, first it began when we had the meetings against the war. Especially the last meeting where Emma and Sasha were arrested. They treated us all, they went with the sticks as if, well, there was no consideration for the human being whatsoever. Then is when I realized that any government, whether it is Tsarist government or American democracy or any liberal regime, those who have power misuse their power against the weaker individual or the masses who are not armed and cannot defend themselves. And I wasn't surprised anymore, no matter what they did. I expected the worst.
Emma Goldman once described Molly Steimer as having an iron will and a tender heart. At age 20, Molly was part of a New York anarchist group that published an underground newspaper. In 1918, she and her comrades were arrested for distributing leaflets protesting American intervention in Russia. One of the young anarchists was beaten to death by the police. Molly and the others were convicted of violating the Espionage Act. At the trial, Molly's spirited self-defense made headlines.
She declared, individual freedom shall prevail in the full sense of the word. To the fulfillment of this idea, I shall devote all my energy, and if necessary, render my life for it. She was sentenced to 15 years at the federal penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri, but she was only to serve a fraction of her term.
Finally, in 1923, I was called to the office in Jefferson, Missouri, and told that I am to be deported and that I am to sign these and these papers. I declined. I said, I don't want to be deported. I don't want to be pardoned. You sentenced me. When all political prisoners will be freed, I will be freed. And I went back to my cell. When I was told that the boys are already in Ellis Island and they're only waiting for me and that I should accept, I did not sign the papers in any event, and I said I'm not going to leave because there is a railroad strike. And I'm not going to go on a train that is led by skips. So I was kept for 10 days longer until the strike was finished. When the strike was finished, they took me, but I never signed my deportation papers. This I never did. Or call them liberation or deportation or whatever it was, I never signed them. My anticipation was that I'm going to a country where there is a revolution, but that the revolution took the wrong road because they have a government, a police regime, and that the anarchists will have to continue the struggle. But there is a revolution, and I went with a certain enthusiasm because there was an uprising against the oppression. That there will be a struggle, there was no doubt in me.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a spontaneous uprising of peasants and workers. All across Russia, workers organized factory committees, called Soviets, and popular assemblies in the villages.
Then the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, swiftly and ruthlessly imposed one-party rule. They claimed that the success of the revolution depended upon the people's obedience to the single rule of the leaders. The Cheka, the secret police, suppressed all non-Bolshevik factions, including the Russian anarchists. The great anarchist theoretician, Peter Kropotkin, returned from exile hoping to see his ideas of mutual aid put into practice. He died in 1921, disillusioned with the course of the revolution. Ironically, many imprisoned anarchists were permitted to attend his funeral, but it was the death knell for anarchism in Russia, and those lucky enough to escape, like Emma Goldman and Molly Steimer, reluctantly turned their backs on the country of their birth.
Years earlier, Michael Bakunin, one of anarchism's leading proponents, warned that the Marxists, instead of abolishing state power, would simply transfer it from one group to another. His words turned out to be prophetic. He said Marx and his friends will concentrate all the powers of government in strong hands. The red bureaucracy will be the most violent, terrible lie our century has created.
My background and how I have become an anarchist is a long, long story. I had entered the Communist Children's Movement, an organization called the Young Pioneers of America, in 1930 in New York City. I was only 9 years of age and had gone through the entire 30s as a Stalinist initially, and then increasingly as someone who was more and more sympathetic to Trotskyism. And by 1939, after having seen Hitler rise to power, the Austrian Workers' Revolt of 1934, an almost completely forgotten episode in labor history, the Spanish Revolution, by which I mean the so-called Spanish Civil War, I finally became utterly disillusioned with Stalinism and drifted increasingly toward Trotskyism. And by 1945, I finally also became disillusioned with Trotskyism, and I would say now increasingly with Marxism and Leninism. But the essential thing, so far as I'm concerned, as I reflect upon all of this now, is that I had gone through a period of Marxism, which is almost unknown today to many American radicals, a period when Marxism was a workers' movement to a very great extent, and when it was a movement in the streets, in which hundreds of thousands of people at times could be brought out in massive demonstrations throughout the country under red flags, whether it be communist or socialist. And by the end of the Second World War, and particularly by the end of the 1940s, I literally saw this movement disappear, and disappear from history, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And I have no belief whatever that it will come back again. Namely, what I'm saying is, I saw the end of the classical workers' movement. And I had to ask myself, why had this come about? What did this mean? And the conclusion I came to is this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and had worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO before it united with the AFL, when it was still in a very militant, stage of its development. That this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. That in point of fact, the factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of a conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served in fact to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function, an adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views, because anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation. And it was concerned not only with economic exploitation, it was concerned with domination. Domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats, in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state. Domination as it exists today in China, even when you're supposed to have a classless society. Domination even as it exists in Russia, where you are supposed to have a classless society. You see. So these are the things that I noted in anarchism, and increasingly I came to the conclusion that if we were to avoid, or if we are to avoid, the mistakes that were made over 100 years of proletarian socialism, if we are to really achieve a liberatory movement, not simply in terms of economic questions, but in terms of every aspect of life, we would have to turn to anarchism, because it alone posed the problem not merely of class domination, but hierarchical domination. And it alone posed the question not simply of economic exploitation, but exploitation in every sphere of life. And it was that growing awareness that we had to go beyond classes into hierarchy, and beyond exploitation into domination, that led me into anarchism and to a commitment to an anarchist outlook.
Power rules the world today. Power corrupts, they say. And absolute power corrupts you. Absolutely. It can change a man who has a heart of gold, make him cruel, wicked, self-centered and cold. Many men in this land, many organizations fought for freedom and justice throughout the land. When they have power and authority, they don't give a damn about nobody.
Hi, I'm Israel Danish for Yippee Helmet. You know, nature has a special way of protecting artificial and natural things. Here's an egg yolk. Look what nature has protected the egg yolk with. Nothing. Now, nature's real helmet, the natural helmet for the egg, is the calcium-lined calcium cover. Watch as policeman Truncheon destroys egg. No good. Nature's helmet for the tomato, a bright red skin, is also valueless when the policeman's truncheon destroys it. Look at this, squash. Everyone thinks the squash is a powerful and an aesthetic movement of vegetablehood, but yet policeman's truncheon destroys nature's squash. Eggplant. Eggplant is flexible, but brain damage has occurred inside. Death. Pumpkin. Closest thing to a human head. When this is brought in contact with a policeman's truncheon, watch what happens. And now the yippee head, human's natural helmet concussion.
When they have power and authority, they don't give a damn about nobody. They prostituting the island, milking the land dry. They making my people starve, exploiting, oppressing, less freedom, more suffering. This thing just can't go on. Take it over. My friend, take it over.
We're doing a film about anarchism in America. Is there an anarchist influence in the anti-nuke movement?
No doubt about it. There's a lot. But it's manifested itself not so much in explicit opposition to the state as such, which is the most common form of anarchism, but in a way of operating that isn't centralist, where people who participate in these demonstrations and want to change their lives do so on a participatory basis rather than taking orders from central authorities. That's the way it tends to go. I mean, it's not that that's always successful, but there's that tendency towards decentralism, a tendency towards consensus operation, and at least from my perspective, a tendency to a strong nonviolent perspective, because I think the state is the ultimate violence. And so to see that nuclear power is violent, nuclear power is centralized, and we want to have a certain technology, we want to have another society where centralism of that sort, that authoritarianism, is dissolved and is more responsive to people's needs. You can't block off the road?
You can't block off the road.
Oh, no, we're not going to block the road.
You don't understand. If we let you drive down there, we're going to have to let everybody else drive down there too, right? We can't have 1,000 cars down there.
You seem to have the power to do what you want.
No, we ain't doing what we're told to do.
You're going to take a chance on the cars being towed away.
Anarchist forms of organization would be a style of organizing that includes the input and decision-making of everyone who is affected. But also, anarchist organizing and decision-making would involve people taking the results of their decisions directly and acting on them, rather than having somebody else do the work for them. That it's participatory in decision-making and in action. And that direct action element, which is embodied within many of the civil disobedience actions in the anti-nuclear movement, such as blocking construction of nuclear power plants. Anarchists have, my understanding of anarchism has as part of its element a connection between ends and means. To me, if one is an anarchist, then from my point of view, one also must be nonviolent, and if one is nonviolent, one must be an anarchist. I see the linkage is very clear. A person who is nonviolent is a person, or who believes in nonviolence, is a person who believes that the sort of society we want to achieve is a society without violence, without wars, and without injustice. And to use wars, violence, and injustice to achieve that society is to be counterproductive.
You're the first person that you won't be able to have. Yeah.
Think it's legal for you to talk to the people on the other side of the fence?
It doesn't matter. They'll do what they want, legal or not.
So do they put the cuffs on tight?
Very tight.
So how do you feel now that you've gotten arrested? You?
Wet.
Just now?
Very wet.
Other than wet?
Wet. I feel fine.
You feel good about it?
Well, of course.
I feel we're doing the right thing.
Do it otherwise.
Yeah.
The basic problem I really have is that whenever I meet leftists and the socialist and Marxist movements, I'm called a petty bourgeois individualist. I'm supposed to shrink under this. Usually I'm called a petty bourgeois individualist by students and by academicians who've never done a day's work life in their entire biography, whereas I have spent years in factories and in trade unions, in foundries and in auto plants. So after I have to swallow the word petty bourgeois, I don't mind the word individualist at all. I believe in individual freedom. It's my primary and complete commitment in individual liberty. That's what it's all about. That's what socialism was supposed to be about, or anarchism was supposed to be about, and tragically has been betrayed. And when I normally encounter my so-called colleagues on the left, socialists, Marxists, communists, they tell me that after the revolution they're going to shoot me. That is said with unusual consistency. They're going to stand me and Carl up against the wall and get rid of us real fast. I feel much safer in your company.
The Libertarian Party is a classical liberal party. And the classical liberal parties believe that people are good, that people can take care of themselves, and that the best way to create a better society is to have smaller government and lower taxes. So we would reduce taxes, we would reduce spending, we would reduce overseas military commitments, and we'd take government completely out of the whole regulation of lifestyles.
There's a lot of confusion between the terms anarchist and libertarian. What's the difference between a libertarian and an anarchist?
I think if you mean by anarchy, disruption and violence, why the Libertarian Party has nothing to do with it, because we think that our program will create a more peaceful society.
I don't mean in the derogatory use of the term anarchist, but say in the way Murray Bookchin or other left-wing anarchists look at the ideology. Serious anarchist. Is there a difference between that kind of anarchist and a libertarian?
Well, I think the whole Libertarian Party is aiming toward very major cuts in government, a very much smaller government, and I don't think that as a political movement, libertarians envision no government as an immediate alternative.
Well, it's hard to tell on the basis of the party's rhetoric, because after all, they're running for state office. But my experience is that most people who are in the Libertarian Party have pretty decent anarchist impulses. Even if they do not say that they're anarchists, most of them will say they are libertarians at any rate. And one thing that is useful is that they have a fairly well-refined analysis of why they aren't conservative. It took the New Left to do a proper analysis of American liberals, it seems to me, and I suspect that the libertarians are doing the best analysis of American conservatives. I think that they're quite good people, and that the party contains within it probably more people of an anarchist tendency than any other organization in the country.
Libertarianism has its roots in American individualism. Although American individualism developed independently of European anarchism, both ideologies shared a profound contempt for government. Unlike the European anarchists, the individualists believed that people had the right to own private property, as long as it had been obtained by their own labor. Benjamin Tucker, editor of the prominent anarchist newspaper Liberty, denounced the capitalist monopoly of money, land, and tariff, and advocated peaceful change, not armed revolution.
Guided by these individualist principles, Josiah Warren founded two cooperative communities, Utopia in 1844 and Modern Times in 1851. Many of the 19th century individualists were also advocates of free love. Ezra and Angela Haywood of Massachusetts were outspoken critics of marriage and the subjugation of women. They were harassed and arrested numerous times for publishing and distributing writings on birth control and sexual freedom.
Individualism was also at the root of a number of homesteading experiments. One of its key theorists was Ralph Bersotti, who believed the only viable social organization was a society of homesteaders who were self-sustaining and who could live without interference from government. Mildred Loomis, one of Bersotti's associates, became a homesteader in the 1940s.
Having grown up on a Nebraska farm, I didn't know anybody was poor or anybody was in need. I was a very naive person when I hit New York City in my graduate work, though I began to be very puzzled by what was called the Great Depression. Remember that? No?
I've heard of it.
You, fortunately, didn't struggle with that. But then's when I really began to question and to be aware of what I call the government system. Maybe you can understand that when I was young, I had a great dream there on the Nebraska farm that if I were to have what I really wanted, I would be a secretary to, what, a congressman in Washington, D.C. But by the time I met Ralph Bersotti working there in Dayton, I had question after question to think through.
Well, all of this centers around homesteading.
Yes.
Well, what principles are there in homesteading that are important?
Well, I would say, in one word, it's responsibility. I think a person who is responsible and by ethics and by the whole natural setting, must be responsible for his own survival. And wherever that is violated by government or business or education or cities or anything at all, where responsibility is taken from human beings, we think it's a mistake.
Do you see any similarities between what you're trying to do and anarchism or the principles of
Well,
anarchism?
if you mean Gilbert Tucker, Benjamin Tucker's anarchism, yes. By all means, because I, years ago, was thrilled by his way to get rid of the monopoly and the exploitation and get it into voluntary association. Sure, I'm all for that. I'm not afraid of the term anarchism, if that's what you mean.
That is what we mean.
But you know, if it's one of these bomb-throwing collectivists against everything, then we question the use of that term. But for good, straight, voluntary, do-it-yourself, we can handle, we can cope, yes.
Great.
There's an instinctual anarchism in the American people, and it goes back to the Jeffersonian tradition. There's a real yearning for self-reliance amongst Vermonters, new and old. I mean, that's what they're up here for, living in these hills. So they appreciate, they're doing it. They may not call it anarchism, but they're doing a lot of the things we talk about.
Like what kind of things?
Well, the first was being self-reliant, creating alternatives that meet your needs rather than accepting what the society as it is when you're born into it. In this little town, it's not a very big town, the people have organized a community center that shows films for adults and for children, that has potluck suppers, theatrical performances, meetings there. I see the latent anarchy, the beginnings of anarchy in New England town meetings. In volunteer fire departments, in food cooperatives, that people are responding to a desire to control their own lives, not be told what to do and how to think, and to be managed and bossed around, but to find ways in which they can take care of their needs, their material and emotional needs, within small groups on a small scale, where there can be direct democracy, and so where people do have a sense of really participating and really controlling their own destinies.
Tell me, what makes this place different from the other factories you've worked in?
It makes it different because each worker has an opportunity to say whatever she likes, she or he likes to, in any of the business part. In our holiday pay, our vacation, or whatever. If we make a loan, that the workers, each individual, each operator has a say. We have to contact everybody. Workers' own is different from all other plants I've ever worked, because usually the head people, the manager and personnel committee takes care of everything. Right here, the workers take care of everything.
That make a difference?
That makes a difference. You build your own business, and then you work it like you want to. You know, and you become a part of it, and it's your business. You're not working for the other man, you're working for yourself.
Is there a different sense of community among the workers here than?
Well, I think the communication is great, because there isn't another one in this area. And everybody, well, you know, we're just starting, so they'll begin to get the feel of it. You know, I think in another year's time, we'll be, everybody will be want to have a part at Workers' Own.
So you sound strongly committed to the idea?
Yes, I am strongly committed to it, because I feel as though it's like working for myself. You know, what I put into it is what I get out of it.
Decentralism and self-management are at the heart of the anarchist philosophy. Anarchists pose the question, why should the decisions which affect our lives be made in a remote, centralized seat of government? It doesn't make sense. People should administer their own lives, not relegate responsibility to somebody else.
The town meeting, the block association, the factory committee, these are all examples of anarchist types of organizations.
One of the things that struck me most when I went to Europe and lived there for a couple of years, was how fucking law-abiding the people were, and how I broke all the laws. And I think I didn't break the laws so much because I was an anarchist, and it was just because I was an American. I mean, if I came to a traffic light, nobody was there, I went through the goddamn thing. It was just an attitude, you know, what's the point of staying here, you know? Or if I could get, you know, if I get out on the left-hand side, and I found that my European neighbors went crazy. Stay in line, you know. It was sort of the constant, like, stay in line, be this way, queue up in England, you know. And I'd say, fuck you, you know. The first one to the bus gets on, you know. And it was this sort of, this crazy American attitude that I had, you know. And I think it was very American, that we are a people who are very smart, you know, that we got a lot of street smarts. I mean, we know what the law is all about. We know who made it and how it gets enforced. I mean, I think if you stop the average American and say, what's the law all about? Did God make it? You say, oh, bullshit, God didn't have anything to do with it. You know who made it. John D. Rockefeller made it.
How can you tell an American? Has he any distinguishing flavor? Could you spot him on an elephant in Turkestan, floating on a raft 50 miles at sea, as you'd know a single leaf from the sassafras tree by its characteristic savor? It isn't that he's short or tall, it isn't that he's round or flat, it isn't that he's civilized or aboriginal, nor the head size of his hat. No, it's just that he hates and eternally despises the policeman on his beat, and the judge at his assizes, the sheriff with his warrants, and the bureaucratic groom, for the sole and simple reason that they tell him what to do. And he insists on eating, he insists on drinking, he insists on reading, he insists on thinking, free of governmental snooping or a governmental plan. And that's an American.
Is this the first rodeo you've been to?
No, this is the second time. We just moved to Truckee last year. Yeah.
And you enjoy it?
It's a great event every year.
So you plan to come back next year?
Obviously, yeah.
Is there something about the rodeo that you think is uniquely American, and is something that it says about the American character?
Independence and individual ruggedness. That's probably the cowboy, the idea of the cowboy still. Yeah.
Let me just get over on the boulevard here a little bit. Just kind of rest here a little bit. We haven't had any chargeable accidents in all my life, and I don't want to run into a neighborhood kid here coming out of school right now or something. I think we're riding in a 1976 Kenworth. It's one of them bicentennial trucks. They came out with this bicentennial truck for our 200th birthday. They made 200 of them. That's the reason for the red, white, and blue decoration on it. Basically, the running gear, the transmission, the engine, the rear ends are all standard type truck equipment. There's nothing extra super special about it. Just a 350. If you're familiar with truck engines, the 350 comes. Yeah, I guess you'd say I'm independent. I don't owe no allegiance to anybody, and whatever the way I can regulate my operation is either make or lose money in the whole operation.
So in that sense, you're independent, but are there other ways in which you're not independent?
Well, we're really not independent because you talk about independent truck drivers, and then you get into the political bureaucracy that we run out of the United States government there in Washington, D.C., and mainly in the rules and regulations. I mean, I don't think a man in Washington, D.C. can dictate to me how to operate this truck.
But they do, don't
financially. Right. Now, that's what I'm saying. That's why I say we've got educated, smart in Washington, D.C. telling us guys, and it's hard for me to explain to somebody or make anybody understand that if you leave me alone, I'll make a darn good living for myself and put a good piece of equipment on the road, given the opportunity. I'm not out here just using this as an excuse to get from point A to point B or from party to party. I'm out here to make a good living, raising 4 children with it, got a wife, got a decent house there in Colorado Springs, and if the government would leave me alone and back off on some of the rules and regulations, I could do even better. That's what I'm saying. There's you know, just because you get elected to an office or you become a political politician, whichever way you want to coin that phrase, don't necessarily make you the big brother that's got to oversee everything that's under your domain. And that's what's happening in Washington, D.C. The people out there feel that they got to be the big brother act, that we're not smart enough down here to do our own thing.
One of the things that we're asking people and trying to explore in the film is not just the explicit anarchism of the individuals of Warren and Tucker and Spooner, but to find out whether there's kind of an implicit anarchism in American traditions and American political history. What's your feeling about that?
Well, I think there's an implicit anarchism in any of the American tendencies that have organized people in opposition to the state. And I think co-ops might have reflected this notion, organizing people not only in opposition to the state, in effect, but in opposition to the major economic movement of the time. I think, as a matter of fact, just in the romantic view of the American character, there's an anarchist tendency. It is flawed by one thing, the abstraction of patriotism. People who will damn the government from morning till night and oppose the state in 1,000,001 ways will, at times of national crisis, become incredibly patriotic and begin to say they will do anything for the state, and they begin to talk of duty, service, sacrifice, all of the words that are the worst words in the world, it seems to me, in a human sense. They begin talking about. Now, I don't know why this is, unless it is that these are such good-hearted people that they really believe that the American state is totally different from any other state, and it's certainly somewhat different, and that they feel that it is important to preserve. They feel they're preserving the country, but the only language that is available is to preserve the state. I have an idea that one of these days there will be another language in which we can talk about preserving the country, the landscape, the neighborhoods, the people in the communities, without talking about preserving the state. At which point there'll be a lot of radical farmers, factory workers, and small-town residents in this country.
Climbing Milestone Mountain, August 22nd, 1937. For a month now, wandering over the Sierras, a poem had been gathering in my mind. Details of significance and rhythm the way poems do, but still lacking a focus. Last night I remembered the date, and it all began to grow together and take on purpose. We sat up late while Denham moved over the zenith, and I told Marie all about Boston, how it looked that last terrible week, how hundreds stood weeping impotent in the streets that last midnight. I told her how those hours changed the lives of thousands, how America was forever a different place afterward for many. In the morning we swam in the cold, transparent lake, the blue damselflies and all the reeds like millions of narrow metallic flowers, and I thought of you behind the grill in Dedham Vanzetti, saying, who would ever have thought we would make this history? Someday mountains will be named after you in Saco. They will be here and your name with them when these days are but a dim remembering of the time when man was wolf to man. I think men will be remembering you a long time, sitting on mountains, many men, a long time. Comrade.
Oh, ho, psycho, psycho, ho, ho, Niccolo, psycho, ho, ho, psycho, psycho, I just want to sing your name. Psycho, 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 ho, ho, psycho, Nicola, psycho, psycho, I just want to sing your name.
Beginning with the First World War, an alliance of the Departments of Justice, Labor, and Immigration initiated a campaign of repression. Agents broke into the homes of suspected radicals, arrested them, and seized their possessions. Many were deported. Most of the victims were foreigners, usually Russians, Italians, and Jews.
Two men stand out as targets of the anti-radical campaign. They were Italian-born, residents of Boston for many years, respectable workers and dedicated anarchists. They were attempting to dispose of some anarchist leaflets when they were arrested on a charge of armed robbery and murder. Their names were Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti.
Psycho Vanzetti, oh, Psycho Vanzetti, Psycho Vanzetti, I just want to sing your name.
The state's evidence was flimsy, and the witnesses for the prosecution gave confused and contradictory testimony. Sacco and Vanzetti proclaimed their innocence, but they were convicted and sentenced to death. Appeal after appeal was denied. The case became an international cause. Marches and defense efforts were organized worldwide.
But on August 23, 1927, the state of Massachusetts, which had condemned Sacco and Vanzetti as violent and dangerous men, mobilized 500 heavily armed policemen to suppress protests and electrocuted the two Boston anarchists.
Fin l'ultimo respiro si ribelleranno, ma poi ancora nuovi tiranni sorgeranno, finché nel mondo dittatori vivranno.
I am a believer in freedom, but of a special kind.
I am an anarchist, and we anarchists believe in freedom from the state, from religion, from all authority. Everybody gets so used to obey some authority or other that they come to think that without the government they cannot live. And when they hear the anarchists saying that you must be the ruler of yourself, you must be the master of yourself, you must be able to organize your own life without the authority of the government, they think that the anarchists are crazy, and naturally they get scared, getting the notion that without the shepherd to lead the sheep, it would be chaos, confusion, anarchy.
You just described the reality, how the state has kind of grown to be this monster. And you've been an anarchist, you deserted the army, 64 years old. You mentioned before that they're the last of a generation of anarchists. What's your feeling about that? I mean, do you feel that you represent the kind of generation of anarchism and radicalism that's gone?
Oh no, anarchism will always be the same. There might be variation between one anarchist and the other anarchist according to the generation in which they live. But the principle is there.
What about your generation of anarchists?
I mean, our generation is all dead, but not the principle. The principle that we had 3 generations ago is the same. They are the same principle today.
Do you see people now carrying on?
We still, we want the people to be able to rule themselves, and the new generation has the same principle. There is no difference between the other one. The only thing that our generation was a generation of hungry people, hungry working people, peasant, hungry worker. While now today, even the working people, in the at least in the industrial cities, in the industrial nation, they live better than the bourgeois of our generation were living.
Anarchy begins with the mind, and American minds for generations have been programmed totally the opposite direction.
Well, okay, the film we're doing, at least at this point, is called Anarchism in America. Now, where do you think you fit into this film?
We fit into this film because we, in our own way, are trying to break down rules, like be them not just written laws, but mental laws, social mores, and American attitudes that have slowly turned this into one of the greediest countries in the world.
Not to try and over-categorize, but what are you trying to do with your music?
The bottom line, in America at least, is we like to get people to think for themselves. We don't come out and say, this is our opinion, think like us, or it's not cool. No, what we're saying is, this is our opinion, judge it for what you will, but for Christ's sakes, have an opinion.
Welcome to 1984. Are you ready for the Third World War?
anarchy in this country is going to be very, very hard to make it work. It'll take like literally long after we're all dead.
I don't believe that one can practice anarchism in this society. I believe it would be utterly illusory to contend, say, that a food co-op can replace general, you know what I mean, Grand Union, or that a so-called People's Bank, to use a concept of Proudhon, who is supposed to have been an anarchist, could replace Chase Manhattan. Nor do I think that one can go around living a holier-than-thou ethical life, you know, that essentially amounts to an ongoing guilt trip against other people. I find that it is basically impossible to live a thoroughly anarchist life within a capitalist society. But I do believe this, that one can try to maintain a high ethical standard. And that is one of the beautiful things about anarchism, that it brings ethics into socialism instead of mere science into socialism, such as Marx does. That one can live an ethical life. One can concern oneself personally with what is humane and what I would prefer to call libertarian behavior. One can protest and one can try to work with projects in which people learn how to take control of their lives, even if in fact they can't do so until there are fundamental social changes. Those are the commitments, I believe, that anarchism seriously poses to the individual. And it raises a very high standard. It is demanding in that respect. It demands that you search into what is a humanistic sensibility and what is a humanistic ethic.
The ideas of anarchism have always been part of the history of the United States. And anarchism survives because it confronts the crucial dilemma of society, the question of authority and the relationship of the individual to the state.
Anarchism alone, among political and social ideologies, opposes not just the authority of the state, of the military, of labor and religious leadership. It opposes the idea of authority itself.
Power rules the world today. Power corrupts, they say. And absolute power corrupts you. Absolutely. It can change a man who has a heart of gold, make him cruel, wicked, self-centered and cold. Many men in this land, many organizations fought for freedom and justice throughout the land. When they have power and authority, they don't give a damn about nobody. Prostituting the island to all and sundry, they peddling my people's right. Exploiting, oppressing, less freedom, more suffering. I wonder how we survive. Think it over, my friend. Think it over again. Think it over, don't vex with me, shorty. Think it over, I'm singing as I see. Food we can't even buy. Murder the price too high. Malnutrition killing the children while we the adults starving. Yet the price is rising without control. Young man begging bread by the side of the road. And the chamber of commerce in this land, I tell you, they don't give one damn. The more we fight, we cannot rise. When they have power and authority, they don't give a damn about nobody. They prostituting the island, milking the land dry. They making my people starve, exploiting, oppressing, less freedom, more suffering. This thing just can't go on. Think it over, my friend. Think it over, carefully again. Think it over, don't vex with me, shorty. Think it over, I'm singing as I see. Work we can't even find. Life seems a waste of time. Nothing to do but sit around the corner lime. Though frustrated, some would rather starve than beg. Others turn to crime and steal what they can get. And the judges have no sympathy. They're hammering everyone that they catch. Even little children are jailed without regret. When they have power and authority, they don't give a damn about you or me. Or what they do, lock me up when they catch me, smoking little tampy while the social rich are freed. Exploiting, oppressing, less freedom, more suffering. A poor man's life is really hard indeed. Think it over, my friend. Think it over, carefully again. Do it again, think it over. Don't vex with me.
Θα ήτανε κάποια Κυριακή, κάποια Δευτέρα. Θα ήτανε καθημερινή, μπορεί και αργία. Θα ήτανε κάποια Κυριακή, κάποια Δευτέρα. Σε κάποιο πείμα του Λόρκα, στους πίνακες του Ριβέρα. Στη θάλασσα του Χικμέτ, στα λόγια του Γκαλεάνο. Και πριν καλά καλά σε βρω, πάντα σε χάνω. Θα ήτανε καθημερινή, μπορεί και αργία. Πλακάτ πανόκρατος κλειστών και απεργία. Σε κάποιο στίχο του Ακυπάνου, του Ρασούλη που φωνάζει. Κι όμως αλλάζει και μάλλον, κι όμως αλλάζει. Όσο σημώνω μακραίνει και έτσι ποτέ δεν τη φτάνω. Απιάστε ωραία ουτοπία, καλά τα λέει ο Γκαλεάνο. Μα όταν γιορτάζει, καινούριους δρόμους μου τάζει. Κι αρχίζω πάλι να πιστεύω πως ο κόσμος αλλάζει. Κι αμφισβητώ τον Γκεμάλ, αμφισβητώ και το Μάνο. Στεκώ στις μύτες των ποδιών, αλλά και πάλι δεν φτάνω. Είναι το παιχνίδι παλιό. Κι αν θες το νόημα να βρούμε, πρέπει λιγάκι ακόμα ψηλότερα να σηκωθούμε. Οι ποιητές μας τα έχουν πει, του παιχνιδιού τους κανόνες τους έχουν γράψει. Με πορφυρί μελάνι αιώνες. Όπως και τότε στη Χιλή, θα ήταν αιώνσε δε Σεπτέμβρη. Κι είπες χαλάλι και χάσταλα Βικτόρια Σιέμπρε. Ήσαν και τώρα που μου είπαν πως είδανε στην Ινδία. Μαζεύε ήλιο και αέρα με όλη την ξυπολιταρία. Με ένα κόκκινο μπερέ, σ' είχανε δει μια φορά. Ήσουν Αλέξη, στο στόμα του το μάσαν καρά. Κι ακόμα τώρα σε βλέπουν, κι όλο τον κόσμο ρωτάνε. Η Δον Κιχώτη κι η Σάντσι που πάνε. Γίνεσαι Μάισα Σελήνη, νύχτα χαράζεις πορεία. Και την ημέρα αφήνεις και ταξιδεύουμε στα αστεία. Θα ήτανε κάποια Κυριακή, κάποια Δευτέρα. Σε κάποιο πείμα του Λόρκα, στους πίνακες του Ριβέρα. Στη θάλασσα του Χικμέτ, στα λόγια του Γκαλεάνο. Και πριν καλά καλά σε βρω, πάντα σε χάνω. Θα ήτανε καθημερινή, μπορεί και αργία. Πλακάτ πανόκρατος κλειστών και απεργία. Σε κάποιο στίχο του Ακυπάνου, του Ρασούλη που φωνάζει. Κι όμως αλλάζει και μάλλον, κι όμως αλλάζει. Σε έχω γυρέψει καιρό, πήρα από πίσω τα ίχνη. Σε ψάξα μέχρι τις Γιάβας, αντάρτες μες στην ομίχνη. Στο Σύνταγμα στην πλατεία σε ψηλαφίσαν μιλούνια. Και πιο πριν στην Ιβηρική πλασά Στελσόλ και Καταλούνια. Στο Μισήρι και στο Τούνε ζήσουν φλόγα και φως. Στο Μεξικό σε βγάλανε γιοσό Ισέν το 32. Ρίχνει τα πέπλα η Σαλόμη, το κεφάλι στο πιάτο. Μα δεν μασάει, αντιστέκεται το πρεκαριάτο. Εργάτες στη Χαλιβουργία, απεργία καμπρώνες. Κι αν σφρακορίχει στην Αστούρια, σαν στάλος κοχώνες. Φοιτητές στο Σαντιάγκο και στο Μοντρεάλ. Γιατί η παιδεία είναι αγαθό δημόσιο και δωρεάν. Στην Αρχεντίνα οδοφράγματα σαν τον παλιό καιρό. Στην Κοτσαμπάμπα δεν πουλιέται ρε κουφάλες στο νερό. Σαν Μάη του 68 χρόνια να έρθει σε περιμένω. Σαν τραγούδι το Σκαρσάβες απαγορευμένο. Ήσουν βιβλίο που το βάλαν φυλακή στην Τουρκία. Και ανταποκριτής νεκρός στη Χόμ στη Συρία. Αλλού σε λένε Σαπάτα κι αλλού του Πακατάρι. Αλλού Σαντίνο, αλλού Τσέκε, στην Ελλάδα Άρη. Θα Θα ήτανε κάποια Κυριακή, κάποια Δευτέρα, σε κάποιο πείμα του Λόρκα, στους πίνακες του Ριβέρα, στη θάλασσα του Χικμέτ, στα λόγια του Γκαλεάνο. Και πριν καλά σε βρω, πάντα σε χάνω. Θα ήτανε καθημερινή, μπορεί και αργία, πλακάτ πανόκρατος κλειστών και απεργία. Σε κάποιο στίχο του Ακυπάνου, του Ρασούλη που φωνάζει. Κι όμως αλλάζει και μάλ, κι όμως αλλάζει. Θα ήτανε κάποια Κυριακή, κάποια Δευτέρα. Θα ήτανε καθημερινή, μπορεί και αργία. Κι όμως αλλάζει, κι όμως αλλάζει.